Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unboxing Blackbox Monitoring for SLOs. I'm Navya Dwarakanath. I'm a senior solutions engineer at CatPoint, where I help our customers in defining and refining their digital end user monitoring strategy. Today, we're going to go over Blackbox monitoring for SLOs, but before we get into the fun stuff, let's go over some of the basics really quickly. So what is a service level? A service level is basically a measure of how well your service is doing what it's supposed to do for your users. Again, notice that I said users, and that's kind of highlighted because that's going to be the core of what we're going to be talking about today. The second thing is, what is a service level indicator? It's basically a quantitative measure of the level of operation of your service. Some of the common ones are availability, latency, throughput. Now, when you bound your SLI with a threshold and a time period, you basically get your SLOs, which is your service level objectives. One quick example, if you say that your availability is greater than 98% over a 10-minute rolling window, that essentially becomes your service level objective, with availability being your quantitative measure or your SLI. That said, let's talk about the two major monitoring methodologies that you can use to obtain these SLIs. First one being Whitebox monitoring, and the second one being Blackbox monitoring. So what is Whitebox metrics? These are essentially metrics that you collect from within your application. More often than not, these are obtained from logs, from applications, emitting these metrics. It could also be some form of instrumentation that you add on top of your code. What these Whitebox metrics do is they give you a sense of the inward workings of your applications. Some of the common Whitebox metrics include CPU utilization, memory utilization, number of HTTP requests processed by your server, number of SQL queries. These are some of the common metrics or the popular Whitebox metrics. However, one thing that we have to keep in mind with any form of monitoring is the end goal. So with monitoring and your service level objectives, what you're trying to answer is the service level acceptable for my end users? So we'll try and see if Whitebox metrics can do this, can answer this question. So consider a server, and Whitebox metrics tells me that this server has high CPU utilization. Now you have users accessing the service running on the server. And clearly, because there is high CPU utilization, there is some kind of an adverse effect. And let's say that it impacts a latency and the user is having a deteriorated experience because of high latency. So in this case, if we ask the question, is the service level acceptable? The answer is no. And Whitebox metric, which is high CPU utilization, is able to answer that question. However, in reality, you always account for failure. You always have redundancy. So for example, there could be a load balancer in between that looks at the CPU utilization and directs traffic to the right server. Because of which, now if you go back to the same question, is the service level acceptable from the perspective of the end user? The answer is yes, but that's not what my Whitebox metrics is telling me. And therefore, in reality, when you're looking at the actual delivery chain of your applications in the real world, one thing that you'll realize is that Whitebox metrics alone, or basically the inside out monitoring that you do, is not sufficient to answer this question or to account for good SLOs and SLIs. Therefore, the ideal scenario is to be measuring these from outside in, from the user to every component on your delivery chain, eventually to your service that is running on either the cloud or your data centers. And this ideal scenario, to some extent, can be achieved with Blackbox metrics. So now, what are Blackbox metrics? These are basically metrics that are collected from outside your application, and they give you a sense of how users perceive the level of operation of your service. Some of the common metrics include availability, latency, throughput, network round trip time. So again, playing this out in the real world, right? So now let's say I'm sitting in my living room. I take a look at my thermostat. It says 70 degrees. And I say, wow, it's a warm day. Call my friend, say, let's go out for a hike. But my friend is out there in his driveway, completely plowing snow because there's a snowstorm. And that's where Blackbox monitoring comes into play, because you need the outside in picture to know what the reality is. And clearly no hike that day, right? So it all boils down to this. Black box monitoring helps you cover the blind spots that are created with just using white box metrics. And notice here that I'm not saying that use one or the other. These two are complementary methodologies, and one is important, as important as the other. It's just that one by itself is not sufficient. Let's take an example real quick, right? So here's an example where we're using synthetic monitoring to simulate a user accessing Microsoft Office, the Teams application. And earlier in April, there was an issue at the DNS layer because of which users were not able to access Teams. Clearly a hit to SLOs, but if you were only looking at white box metrics, you would have completely missed this because the DNS issue is happening at the client level. Even before you get an IP address, things are failing. And therefore, with black box monitoring, where you're completely controlling the client side and simulating this traffic, you will be able to catch this failure. One other blind spot, and from a latency perspective, here is an example of an application deployed in AWS East and West. East is definitely looking bad, West is looking good. If you had any kind of telemetry, white box telemetry behind the cloud, you would not be able to understand if there's an issue. Everything would look green. Because in this case, the issue was between the load balancer and the US East deployment. But from a user perspective, clearly you've missed your SLO because there are a huge number of users in multiple locations across the globe who are experiencing a deteriorated level of operation. And again, one thing to note when it comes to black box monitoring is that you have to be monitoring from where your users are coming. So if your users are not coming from AWS, you can't be just monitoring from the cloud. If your users are coming from Boston AT&T, Boston Verizon, these actual ISPs, it's important to monitor from these locations, even if it's black box monitoring. Even if you're just simulating that, ensure you're using a monitoring strategy where you can simulate these requests from actual locations where these users will be coming to your services. One other question to answer is that I have so many different metrics with black box monitoring. What do I use? I would say use high-level metrics. So for example, if response is a accumulation of other metrics like DNS, connect, SSL, wait, and load, even when there's a fluctuation, for example, in the graph on the at the top, you'll notice that wait went up, SSL went down. But it's possible that the accumulation of all these metrics is still flat. Because of which, from a user's perspective, the service level and the operation of the service is fine. So your SLIs will still be response time. But when you're trying to troubleshoot, debug, optimize your services, that's when you need some of these more nuanced metrics like DNS, connect, SSL, wait, and load. So still continue to collect these metrics, but when it comes to SLIs, try and do it on high-level metrics. One other thing with black box monitoring is that because you're running these monitors from actual locations where your users are coming, you will have to account for regional differences. So you will go from a simple statement like my latency has to be less than 250 milliseconds to a more complex statement where you're saying I need my latency to be less than 55 in United States, 160 milliseconds in Belgium, and 250 milliseconds in India. So you go from a simple to a compound statement. Eventually, you should also think about how can I mature my practice of using black box monitoring. And the highest level of maturity comes from monitoring end-to-end user journeys. Even when you start off your journey, right, make sure that your SLOs and SLIs are based on the critical user journey. So clearly here, if I'm trying to buy your headphones and the buy button is missing, it is clearly a miss on my SLO. And therefore, it becomes important to look at end-to-end user journey. So here's an example of synthetic monitoring, where we're simulating a user going through the entire workflow of purchasing something from an e-commerce site, homepage, product page, checkout, delivery. And your SLI becomes the entire critical user journey in itself. And that is the level of maturity you should hope to achieve with black box monitoring. In the end, I want to wrap up by saying that there is no silver bullet. There's no single method that you can use. Every method has its trade-off. So for instance, if you're just relying on server-side metrics, you miss out on all the data between the client and the server. If you're using black box metric, it's only a representation of the real user traffic. And therefore, know that when you're choosing your SLIs, you pick a method, know the trade-offs, or you pick two different methods and understand how they're compatible and how they cover up the blind spots the other creates. Awesome. With that, I come to the end of my talk. I hope that you were able to understand a thing or two about Blackbox Monitoring and how that can be useful for you in your organization. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Slack. And with that, I wish you the very best with your SLO journey. Here's me signing off. Thank you very much.